How's it going, YouTube? Coming to you today with another video, and today, guys, the video is going to be telegraphing. Now, this is one of the most difficult concepts to explain, and this is something that can highly elevate your gameplay. And this is such an important tool that people use in every single game that they play because it just gives you so much information. And if you haven't already checked out my sponsors over on Gem, Cloud, Arla, Imperium, Dragonshield, RW, MainPhaze, and Grimoire, you definitely should do so. Check out my METAFY for one-on-one coaching, and then subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so we can hit our goal at 30,000. And without further ado, let's hop into this topic that is, again, telegraphing. Now, this means expecting what your opponent has by the actions that they take. Now, these are unintentional actions and intentional actions. If you activate 0 and they like flinch, right? They might have an Ash or a Bell, and they're determining if they want to use it on your 0's first effect or when you tag it out in the next turn. So this is something that you got to be thinking about whenever you activate a card. If your opponent like looks at their hand, if they like check a back row, right? These are things that people unintentionally do that it can cost them the game because it telegraphs you a couple things, right, that we can assume. And telegraphing is basically like educated assumptions, I would say. So the next thing that we can talk about in terms of telegraphing is if your opponent normal summons or just like summons Medius the Pure, they could summon 3 different things, relatively. They either summon Nervado, which probably means they're playing the FTK, because they're going to go summon Nervado, make non-finito, set recapture, and then combo. They could summon Archmage Power Patron, which means that they're probably just playing Archmage. Or they summon the Elf Note Power Patron, which means that they're either playing like the branded Elf Note or they're playing the Fiendsmith Elf Note. It's going to depend on what they summon next, right? So if they summon the Armades, they're playing Fiendsmith. If they summon the Librarian, they're probably just playing Elf Note, right? And they still could be on like the branded cards too, but it might even be more of like a pure build. Let's say that you're playing against Mitsurugi. One of the most common end boards that you see out of your opponents in Mitsurugi is going to be going for the Gallant Granite first before they make like an IP or an SP, and they'll add Nibiru. Then you already saw during your opponent's turn that they added Prayer and Purification. Then your opponent sets 4 and passes with like their normal end board, right? This could tell you a couple things. So you already know 2 of those sets are Prayer and Purification. What are the other sets? If they added Nibiru, they probably have an Impulse set, because they need to be able to use Nibiru and Impulse, right? So this is a very easy telegraph to tell that they set more than 2 cards. One of the sets could easily be a Dominus Impulse. Cards that are also common right now are Droplet and Imperium. It could be either of those, right? We have been seeing an uptick in Magatama. Now, this is something that you more than likely would see searched unless they like hard opened it, right? But this is another card that the other set can be. So you have Prayer, Purification, some kind of interruption, and the other 2, right? Just determines on which interruption it is. But the biggest assumption is that one of them is probably Impulse. In a normal scenario, if you're trying to figure out if it's a Solemn Warning or a Super Poly, you can kind of tell pretty quick which one it's going to be. If you like normal Ray and it doesn't get warninged, right? The back row could be a Super Poly. If you're playing Cool Tune and you go directly into Maker and Maker doesn't get warninged, it could be a Super Poly, right? Like, these are the checks that you're like, okay, I know what my deck does and I know the spots that they should warning. And if I'm not getting warninged here, then it's not solemn, right? It could be accusation, but it's not like judgment or warning for the most part. And if your opponent still has the set and they haven't really done anything with it, then you can just say like, okay, it's probably a super poly. Now, there could be other options that the set cards could be, but I think the two biggest scary things in the world right now is if your opponent has a super poly or a warning. And this is the way that I really go about determining which one it is. It's kind of the same thing that you can assume with like the hand. If your opponent has only been using 4 cards out of their hand, and then they add a bunch of other cards, but like you know the whole hand, but like one card's dead, it's a hand trap, right? Like we know it's some kind of hand trap. And if it's been sitting there for like 3 turns, because in your mind you can kind of keep track of like what's going on in the hand, and it's still sitting there and they started and it's game 1, it's probably a dead Mulcharmy, right? So this is what's really important about like really keeping track of like what your opponent does, how many cards they have, and like what cards haven't been used, because a lot of times you can deduce a lot of information based on what your opponent still has and what they're just like not using. The next one is going to be decks like Malice. So if you watch your opponent just go like normal Chessy Cat effect, right? This is something to me that tells me that they have another way to play usually. Because if you Ash a Chessy Cat and they don't, they probably just lose. But if they're like not normaling a rabbit or a dormouse, right, where you lose to less cards and they just lead Chessy, leading Chessy is pretty scary because you can already lose to quite a few things. And if you don't have another way to play, you don't have like a field spell, a March Hare, a Bestial, right, then you're kind of putting yourself in a really bad position. So this can either tell you that their hand is like pretty weak, but you already know that they can banish another Malice card from hand. So either they're playing extremely greedy if they don't have another way to play, or they're just going to use this to like bait out the first interruption so they can like continue playing. Now, the thing about this though is there's not a lot of good places to just like Ash this deck. So like if your opponent normals Chessy effect, I'm Ashing, Imperming, Veiloring, like anything that I got is just going toward the Chessy Cat. So like this can either tell you that their hand's really bad, or this is just like the first step into like a couple long-winded plays that they have. Because you already know that there's something else in their hand that they can use, because unlike cards like Vision, you have to banish a Malice card first. So this is definitely a very unique situation where you're like, okay, like there's something else in the hand, but if it's not exactly Field Spell or like March Hare, I'm probably okay, right? So this is something that you got to think about, and this is like your thought process that has to go on when you start seeing your opponent commit cards to the board, because you have to look at your hand and determine where the best spots are for your hand traps to go or your interruptions. It's very similar in Branded. If your opponent leads Branded Fusion, their hand is either really, really bad, or they're activating this and hoping that you hit this instead of Fallen of High Spirits or Fallen of White Dragon. So you either Ash this and they pass, or you let this go and they're like, well, that didn't work, and they summon Fallen of White Dragon or activate Branded High Spirits, and then you hit that and they're like, wow, like that sucks, right? Like that's not great. So it really is a question mark sometimes whether or not it's correct to just go ahead and hit the first thing that you see. But sometimes that first card can tell you everything that you need to know. Talking about that first card, if your opponent leads KTS in Cool Tune, they are probably in a really, really bad spot. Normal Rico will get you there. Normal Q will get you there. If you go Rotary Reveal Ash, that'll get you there. If you normal mix, it's like a really weird line because you can't exactly do what you want to do unless you have another 2 in hand, right? So it's a little worse. But you have a lot of plays that you can do in this deck, and this deck is quite literally half hand traps. So if your opponent goes draw phase KTS, they're in a really bad spot. And this could be just like different, I guess, at some point, but for the most part, if I see my opponent lead this, I'm like, okay, their entire hand is hand traps, and this is all they have. Other things you can tell just based off of what your opponent does with certain cards. So if you're really trying to get hand knowledge the best that you can by trying to understand through their plays, you can really see in cards like Non Finito, if they go like this card set Vandalism, and then you see them set another card from hand, The set is the recapture, right? So now you know exactly where recapture's at because they're not going to continue playing without that on the board. So there's no reason for them to like not set it, right? Unless their hand is like crazy unplayable, right? And they like absolutely like needed the vandalism, then sure. But most times you're going to see your opponent immediately set a card right after. And recapture is only monster effects. So like this is something that's huge to know, especially if you have vision in hand. You can just go vision MST pop recapture because you know exactly where it's at, right? And that's pretty good knowledge to know, especially if your opponent's just like random setting. You know it's not random. Another thing that happened to me yesterday that I felt was pretty telegraphed at the time was I passed with 4 backrow and Shizuku, and my opponent went vision draw 2. And in my eyes, not grabbing something like MST told me that they already had a lightning storm or a duster. And that's exactly what happened. My opponent had a lightning storm, and I was able to just kind of use my cards properly immediately, right, to make sure that I had the most value. Even being able to chain things like Lemnis Gate to like save some of my back row as well was really impactful. So that's something that you really got to think about because this could just be them deep drawing to see engine. But also, if your opponent has a really hard time into your back row and they know that there's like absolute blowouts in the back row, they might be more inclined to just grab an MST to help chip away at back row before they start playing. So this is something that if you see your opponent do this, you can 50-50 deduce that they might already have a lightning storm or a duster. If this video did help you today, definitely let me know down below in the comment section. If you haven't already checked out my Twitter, Twitch, Discord, Instagram, or subscribe to the channel, definitely go ahead and do so. I appreciate all of you, and I'll see you all at Columbus.